to echo everything that my brothers have said. It's been a wonderful service. The songs have been uplifting. The prayers have been well prayed, and then the lessons have been very well studied and prepared. And we want to say thank you to all the speakers and all of the work that you put in. It's not easy to condense a topic down to a short amount of time and present it accurately and in an organized manner. So we're thankful for all of the work that you all put in. We read in Isaiah, the 5th chapter, verses 20 and 21, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." What we read here expressed in the book of Isaiah is the eternal problem of the struggle between good and evil. Charles Darwin once said, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones." In other words, the father of evolution, what Charles Darwin is telling us here, is that I cannot see a way for there to be a moral standard without the existence of a God, of heaven, and of hell. In our modern society, it has become increasingly popular to say things such as, "My truth is different from your truth. My philosophy, my culture, my truth is different from your truth. My morality is different from your morality because of the differences between us." Is good and evil a concept which we as humans invented, which society came up with? Is morality something that was created, or is it something that has always existed? Without God, where does good and evil come in? I want you to consider this dramatic historical analogy. In the mid to late 1940s, almost 200 Nazi figures were tried by a committee representing the countries of France, Great Britain, the USA, and the USSR. For the first time in history, judges from 4 different countries served together by a committee in order to investigate evidences of atrocities, massacres, and cold-blooded mass executions which are being perpetrated, and I quote, "by Hitlerite forces in many of the countries they have overrun." During the Nuremberg trials, raw footage was shown of concentration camps. Various testimonies, including those of survivors, were featured. And in the end, 161 of the 199 defendants were found guilty. Of the 161, 37 were executed. I want to talk about 4 things I believe that we as Christians can take away from this historical example. Number 1, morality is something that pre-exists. It's not something we create. The Nazis' wickedness was not wrong because someone decided it was wrong. It was wrong simply because it was wrong. We don't decide when something is right or wrong. We don't create morality. We don't come up. We discover morality. And you can discover more about it, sure, but morality is something that pre-exists. Number 2, morality is something that extends beyond borders. It's a very common thing in debates nowadays when you're talking about morality and the concept of good and evil, that an atheist will say, well, if you look over and you go over to a different country out in the East, they're going to have totally different moral values than we have here in the West. But I want to point out to you that cultures from across the world, across borders, came together and recognized in unison that what these men did was evil, 100% wrong and evil. Despite the fact that there were borders between them, the world recognized that what these men were doing was wrong. This example shows that at least certain moral values apply to everyone, despite where we live. We are all accountable. Number 3, morality is something that can be judged. Of course, the big thing in our culture is say, don't judge me, right? But this is really a misunderstanding of the biblical concept. As Christians, we have to recognize and at times expose the evil in our society, the evil in our world. We cannot ignore what is in front of us. As Brother Aaron talked about the other night, sometimes it is easier to stay silent. But as Christians, there is a time to be silent, but there is also a time to speak up. Justice is one of the key attributes of God, which brings us to number 4. Justice was necessary for these men. Would it have been morally right if these men had gone unpunished for their crimes? Would it have been morally acceptable for these men to go off completely free. Anybody who was affected personally by the Holocaust, of course, would tell you no. Yes, God is both loving and compassionate. God is love, as Brother Taylor said in 1 John 4:8. But God is also the righteous judge of justice. He is a holy God. And he says in Romans 12:19, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. From this example, we know that good and evil is something that is not created. We know that it applies to everyone and that can be judged, and it is something that demands justice. Without God, none of those things are true. I want you to listen closely. In a world where God doesn't exist, the Nazis are only wrong according to our opinion. In a world without God, we are hopeless. If morality is something that's just some sort of natural evolutionary response, it would only be wrong because we just happened to evolve in just the right way to make us think that what the Nazis did was evil. Otherwise, morality would be different for every person. Of course, morality demands justice, but morality can be judged, and we as Christians can recognize when evil is being done and when good is being done as well. Proverbs 3:5-7, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seems right to a man, but his end is the way of death. And as the old prophet Jeremiah said, Jeremiah 10:23, O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in a man who walks to direct his own steps. It is not within us to direct our own steps. God legislates morality. It is God's judgments that decide what is morally good and evil. Now, Brother Noah, he talked about some arguments for the existence of God. And there's another argument that people will bring up. There's really three classical arguments, and he talked about the first two, the law of cause and effect, the law of a design and a designer, but there's also the law of good and evil, often called the moral argument. Essentially, the moral argument goes like this. Number one, we recognize that there is an objective moral standard, right? There's something that we are all to follow of good and evil, a set of rules, if you would, or precepts. The premise, too, is that these standards that exist within nature, such as the laws of science, the laws of reason, the laws of logic, and yes, the laws of morality, are not something that can be explained by nature. They are something that already exists. It exists outside of natural explanation. So the conclusion is, therefore, this objective moral standard must be explained by something outside of nature, i.e., God. Now we read in Romans 2:14-16 this, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, listen to this, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts. Their conscience also bearing witness between themselves, their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. In the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Paul is saying these Gentiles, they weren't under the law of Moses, but it's not like they weren't under any law. They had a separate law. They had the moral law, as it's often called, the law written on our hearts. And we recognize that that law that is written on our hearts, that is what God has placed there. But in a world where God does not exist, in a godless world, that doesn't happen. Morality is not something natural unless God exists. Otherwise, we are just a series of random chemical accidents who just evolved in just the perfect way to tell us that Hitler was an evil man. So if you're here today and you're having doubts about God, I would encourage you with this. Know that it's okay to have questions. It's okay to have questions, but it's not okay to not do anything about those questions. It's not okay to not do anything about those questions. There are so many good resources out here. There are brothers and sisters here who are members of the church and would point you to these resources about what is often called apologetics. I also want to point out that if you're here and you're having doubts, I want you to consider the implications of those doubts, because if you take those doubts to their full extent, if you take agnosticism or the state of not caring whether God exists or not, or if you take even atheism to its farthest reaches, you will find a world where you cannot actually condemn what Hitler and the Nazis did. And I also want to point out, just in lieu of our meeting theme, that this is a great evangelistic tool when you're talking to friends, when you're talking to family or somebody who's struggling. People will say things like, well, how can a good God send somebody to hell? Well, would it be fair for God to not punish anybody? We already talked about how justice is something that's necessary. So would it be fair for God to not send anybody to hell? That's a question to ask them. People will say, well, how can a good God exist when there is so much evil in the world? Ask them, how do you define evil? Where do you get this concept of good and evil? Because in a world without God, there is no definite definition for good and evil. If they say, well, I don't believe in God because of what he's done, because he killed people, or because he doesn't support fill in the blank group of people, I would ask them, where are you getting your moral standard from? Because if you're saying that God is doing something that is evil, well, that's just according to your opinion, because you don't have a higher moral standard to go off of. And of course, without God, isn't my opinion just as valuable as your opinion? And also, I think this is very important when we're talking about an evangelistic setting where we're trying to convert somebody. You don't have to explain their position for them. The best thing you can ask them is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Make them explain their position to you, because that's not your job. You don't have to defend their position for them. And so we have found that the objective moral standard does in fact exist. To put it plainly, without God, good and evil would be nothing more than a matter of our opinion. Without God, what Hitler and the Nazis did in the Holocaust cannot actually be condemned. With no moral standard outside of ourselves and our own thoughts, we cannot define good and evil. Isaiah said, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put sweet for bitter, or bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Now comes the point in our service where we recognize our responsibility to the moral standard. I want to read to you Romans 3 and verse 23. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We've recognized today about these Christian principles. We've heard a lot about Christian principles at this meeting, especially at this service. These ideas of these precepts in which we are to follow God's good and righteous law. And so now comes to the point where we recognize that we have a responsibility to accept that covenant relationship. We have a responsibility to accept that law because each of us is subject to it. And then as Brother Todd Reisinger was talking this morning, I thought about an analogy I heard a few months ago. And I thought about this idea of this moral law in which we all follow, and this idea of justice and judgment. And I thought about this analogy. I'm going to read exactly what it says here. It says, this is a story, this is an analogy, but it's based on a true story. It says, when he was a young man, Judge Warren Candler practiced law. One of his clients was charged with murder, and the young lawyer made the utmost effort to clear his client of the charge. There were some extenuating circumstances, and the lawyer made the most of them in his plea to his mother and father, and moreover, they were present in the court, his aged mother and father of the man charged with murder. And the young lawyer worked on the sympathies and emotions of the jury by frequent references to the God-fearing parents. In due course, the jury retired for deliberation. When they had reached a verdict, they returned to the jury box. The verdict read, we find the defendant not guilty. The young lawyer, himself a Christian, had a serious talk with his cleared client. He warned him to steer clear of evil ways and trust God's power to keep him straight. Years passed. Again, the man was brought to court. Again, the charge was murder. The lawyer who had defended him on his first trial was now the judge on the bench. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury rendered the verdict guilty. Ordering the condemned man to stand for sentencing, Judge Candler said, at your first trial, I was your lawyer. Today, I'm your judge. The verdict of the jury makes it mandatory for me to sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. Graham ended the story by commenting, today, Christ is our lawyer, our Savior, willing to forgive and to cleanse and to forget. However, there is coming a fearful day when he will be our judge. There is coming a day when he will be our judge and he will be your judge, and you will have to stand before him and explain to him why you do not obey his righteous law. And there might be coming a day when you have to answer why you once entered in that covenant relationship and you failed him and you left the only one who ever loved you. So if you're here today and you're subject to the gospel call, or if you're subject to the prayers in the church, or if that's a request to prayers of the church, if you're struggling in your life, as Brother Landon said, the affectionate, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And we can pray for you, help you on your journey.